Bloodstains on the mausoleum floor. Bloodstains the Colosseum doors. Lies on the lips of a priest. Rolling in the Rolls Royce Corniche.
O escritor americano F. Scott Fitzgerald, autor de O Grande Gatsby, era um observador arguto da maneira de viver entre milionários. Um dia ele comentou com o amigo Ernest Hemingway: "Os ricos são diferentes de nós." "Sem dúvida", respondeu Hemingway debochado. "Eles têm mais dinheiro." Mais dinheiro, mais status, mais poder e influência do que as pessoas nas camadas mais pobres. Que efeito tem isso sobre a sociedade como um todo? Fitzgerald e Hemingway conversavam nos anos 20 do século passado, quando a renda do chefe de uma grande empresa americana era cerca de 30 vezes maior que a de um empregado seu na linha de produção. Hoje, quem está no topo da pirâmide ganha pelo menos 300 vezes mais que um funcionário na base. Às vezes, ganha até mais do que isso. A diferença de renda nos países ricos se acentuou. A desigualdade aumentou e preocupa. O presidente Barack Obama já se referiu a essa desigualdade crescente na sociedade americana como o desafio de nossa época. O Fórum Econômico de Davos, em 2014, foi além dos Estados Unidos e consultou 700 formadores de opinião pelo mundo. Descobriu que a preocupação maior deles não era com nova crise financeira ou fraco crescimento. Era com a desigualdade de renda e seus efeitos sobre a sociedade. A ONG Oxfam ilustrou essa diferença na mesma época com a revelação de que as 85 pessoas mais ricas do mundo tinham renda equivalente a 3,5 bilhões de outras pessoas no planeta. Qual o impacto dessa desigualdade crescente? Resulta em mais doença, crime, violência? Gera infelicidade ou frustração? Ou faz parte do jogo da economia de mercado e até serve de estímulo para melhorar de vida? Quem pesquisa esse assunto há vários anos é Richard Wilkinson, da ONG britânica Equality Trust, autor de vários artigos sobre o tema e do polêmico livro The Spirit Level, já traduzido em 24 idiomas, com análises de estatísticas internacionais sobre os efeitos da desigualdade. We have all heard the cliché, the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer. The question is that trend everywhere, and isn't that kind of inevitable? If you have more money, after all, it's easier to make more money.
It's been very widespread since around 1980 and the decades since then in most of the developed countries and many developing countries. It wasn't true in most countries from about 1930 to 1980. Throughout that period, income differences got smaller. The wages of people lower down the social ladder increased faster than the wages at the top. But that pattern was reversed from about the time when Reagan and Thatcher came to power and neoliberal economics took hold of became the dominant ideology. Brazil, though, I think has been becoming more equal over the last few decades, but it's still one of the more unequal countries in the world.
If we look at the other side of the coin, the countries that do not have such a widespread difference that your research mentions frequently, the Scandinavian countries. But how about those countries, for instance, in Eastern Europe during Soviet times? They were fairly equal, but those...
Yes, it's very interesting looking at those countries because you find that up till the late 60s or around 1970, the performance in terms of life expectancy of Eastern and Western European countries overlapped. So East Germany had better life expectancy than West Germany, although it was poorer. But then from about 1970, health ceased to improve right across Eastern Europe and the Soviet bloc. And a huge life expectancy gap opens up between communist and non-communist countries, with no overlap at all. All the communist countries end up by doing worse than the others, although they've done well earlier on. I think it's when the bureaucracy gets cynical, self-serving, where, the police state and lack of freedom and so on, all that gets more important. What we advocate actually is very unlike the attempts at greater equality in those countries. They did it by diktat. We think we should do it by an extension of democracy into the economic sphere, by employee representatives on company boards, by more employee buyouts of companies. By basically, instead of a limitation of democracy, we think we should increase equality by an extension of democracy.
So along the lines of the model that the Scandinavian countries offer?
Yes, they've moved in that sort of direction, but about half the members of the European Union, about half the countries in the European Union, have at least some legislation for employee representatives on company boards. It's very weak in some of those countries, but in others, like Germany, it's quite strong. And depending on the number of employees in a company, there are different levels of representation. So when a company gets to 2,000 employees in Germany, half the members of the remuneration committee deciding incomes, wages, have to be employee representatives. In Britain and the United States, there's no legislation like that, and our income differences have widened even more than European partners.
In order to tackle the problem, be it in poor countries or in rich countries, where do you see the role of the state? Because as you know, in neoliberal economics, the state is looked upon as the devil. The less state you have, the better it is for the economy. It's automatically associated with something bad. But do you think there is an important role there for the state?
I think there is. There are basically two quite different ways of reducing income differences. One is redistribution through taxes and benefits. And I think we have to tackle tax avoidance, tax havens, both by rich individuals and companies. But more important, and I think more fundamental, is to reduce the income differences before tax, the differences in market income. And, the big drivers of inequality has been the takeoff of top incomes, the bonus culture. I think that is an indication of the lack of any democratic constraint on top incomes. And differentials, income differentials within companies, a paper looking at the 350 biggest US companies, the pay differences within them in the 1970s, around 1980, the CEOs were earning, say, 30 or 40 times as much as the ordinary production workers. But by the time you get to the first decade in the 21st century, those differences are 10 times as large. They're earning 300 or 400 times as much as the production workers. And, there's no more powerful way of telling a whole swathe of the population, you people are worth almost nothing, than to pay them 1/3 of 1% of what someone else in the same company gets. And then what is awful, of course, is that people start saying, well, the problem with the poor is low self-esteem, and not understanding how the material differences give rise to that sense of worthlessness and that you're not valued by anyone and you're just used when it suits them.
To what extent there's a cultural factor involved in here besides just economics?
I think actually, people often ask me that question, thinking maybe this is a reflection of culture rather than of income differences. I think that the income differences determine the culture. There are now studies that show that in more unequal countries, people are less willing to help each other. There's good data for large number of European countries showing that even if you ask about willingness to help old people or disabled, they're less willing to in more unequal countries.
So there's more solidarity, more cohesion.
Yes.
Countries, there are less
Yes, exactly. And more status anxiety. You know, in more unequal societies, people at the top are so important, and the people at the bottom are worth nothing. And so where do you come? You know, we all get more, we judge each other more by status. And so more status anxiety, the surveys show that right across the society where there's more inequality.
Well, the gap is the serious consideration. But you mentioned the big change that happened when, at the time that Reagan and Thatcher came into power and imposed a certain form of economic philosophy. Do you think that is an inevitable trend now, that there's no going back?
No, I don't think so. I think rather the opposite. In the 20th century, there's sort of U-shaped distribution of inequality. It's high until sometime around 1930 or soon afterwards, and then it falls away and then rises again later from 1980. But that whole U-shaped pattern of greater equality is a reflection of, I think, the strength of trade unions, the labour movement, the social democratic parties as a countervailing voice in society. Why income differences rise from 1980 and why neoliberal economics takes hold is that force dies away. You know, the whole socialist movement forgets what it's about. The Eastern Europe comes crashing down. You know, there was a time when I think that communism seemed quite a threat to capitalism, and in a way that was made capitalism more humane.
Felt obligated to make up for it.
By the time we get to the even the 1970s, we know that economically there are basket cases, that those economies aren't working, and they cease to be a threat. And even politicians like Blair start to think that inequality doesn't matter. That's actually quite an interesting thing, the way even social democrats throughout the world stopped thinking inequality matters very much. And I think they did that because they had a view of inequality mattering when a large proportion of the population live in great hardship and squalor. Then it's wrong for other people to live in great luxury. But now that in the rich countries, even the poor have 2 or 3 bedroomed homes and they've got central heating and DVDs and cars and so on, maybe inequality doesn't matter. I think that's why they stopped paying attention to it. But what we are showing is that inequality has psychosocial effects, affecting behavior, affecting social relations. People have always had an intuition, I think, from French Revolution or before, that inequality is divisive and socially corrosive. And now that we can compare societies, actually look at the data for different countries, we see that that intuition is profoundly true. In more unequal societies, people trust each other less. Community life weakens. We have less to do with each other. And in many ways, I think the data suggests almost that we become nastier people in more unequal societies.
In researching this subject, I ran into a comment by the American economist Robert Samuelson, in which he says that we create simplistic narratives and imagine that punishing the rich will miraculously uplift the poor. And he adds on, the poor are not poor because the rich are rich. The two conditions are generally unrelated. Are they?
I think that as the rich get richer and the social distance, the material differences between rich and poor get greater, the problem is that the rich take over the politics of the society. And we've seen that happening so much in the United States. So there can be really serious problems in the bulk of society, and the rich are almost often unaware of it, or their interests are completely opposed to doing anything about the problems of poverty or poor educational performance or drugs or whatever might be going on in the rest of society. They insulate themselves in gated communities and so on, and they buy up the politicians. That's the real damage that connects, in a way, the rich and poor. But the other thing is that what matters, I think, is it's not a matter of absolute standards of living, it's a matter of relativities, how you compare with others. You see, in our book, when we look at national income per head in the rich countries, there is no relationship with life expectancy in those countries, no relationship with measures of child well-being, no relationship with mental illness or any other measure of well-being. But when you start to look at the gaps between us, it matters very much indeed. It's that explains why income differences matter. And I think sometimes, you know, the reason why we've become more unequal is because the top 1 or few percent have run away from the rest of us. I think that's made us all feel, in a way, in some sense, deprived or inferior, something like that.
There seems to be also an argument from the side of the elite that the poor are poorer because of some kind of a character problem.
I think that what people are misunderstanding there is how depressing low social status is. You know, as I said, some people are so important and other people are worthless. It saps your confidence. Unemployment damages self-confidence, lowers self-esteem. Depression is sometimes likened to the residual or remnant of a submission response. If you think of animals in a dominance hierarchy, you know, when you're depressed, you're feeling incapable, everyone else is better than you become very unchallenging to a dominant. And there is now an area of psychology dealing with what they call the dominance behavioral system. And people have identified areas of the brain which deals with social status issues. And you can see where we all become more worried about how we're seen and judged by others, what people think of us. There are two responses. One is to go under, to feel lack of confidence, low self-esteem, depression, social anxiety, not want to have contact with other people because it's too challenging. The other response, also coming out of that insecurity about how you're seen and judged, is to talk yourself up, to say, I'm really good, you know. I was one of the youngest people to get an award. You know, I got promoted when to flaunt your achievements and abilities. Then there's now a study which I think includes data for Brazil, which show that kind of self-aggrandizement or self-enhancement is stronger, much stronger in more unequal societies. So, you know, income inequality is not a superficial thing. It's absolutely fundamental to all our conception of social hierarchy.
Investment guru Warren Buffett was an interesting person for this source of things. Somebody asked him if there was a class war going on. And he said, sure there is, and we're winning. Do you think he's right?
I think what he was talking about, of course, is that income differences are getting bigger, and they still are. But I don't think that's going to go on for very much longer, because there's the growing signs of a public reaction to that.
Where do you see that?
Well, anger at the bonus culture, and the beginnings of attempts by governments to start talking about tax avoidance, how to deal with tax havens. They so far haven't done enough, but I think that those issues will go on causing trouble until effective action is taken. But Another reason why we have to tackle these inequalities, I think, is how we respond to climate change. If we're going to move towards sustainability, the biggest threat, I think, is consumerism. That's driving ever higher levels of consumption and waste, because it's all about status competition, and status competition is a zero-sum game. We can't all improve our status together. One person can improve it over the others and pushes them down a bit. So that's why there's no net gain through status competition. But because consumerism is driven by status competition, and that is intensified by inequality, if you're going to rein in consumerism, you have to reduce inequality. You can see the connections between consumerism and inequality very clearly. In more unequal countries, people work longer hours. They save less of their income. They get into debt more. Because money is how you show what you're worth. The more inequality, the more money matters as a way of showing your status.
Would you think that perhaps the movement, street movements, popular movements, and trying to change that situation, do you see that growing?
There's certainly much more attention to inequality issues in the media. We set up something called the Equality Trust, which at one time was monitoring media coverage. And it was growing slowly from the crash of 2008, but just a trickle. With the Occupy movement, it grew very substantially and is still growing. And I think that with that comes the possibility of much bigger mass movements. And you're seeing that in some countries, where austerity programs are most severe, in Portugal and Greece and places, enormous opposition to what governments are doing. But many of the rise and fall of protest movements is extraordinarily unpredictable. Sometimes massive protests seem to come out of almost nothing. And I remember France in 1968. Completely unpredicted. The uprising then that came close to revolution.
Well, the Arab Spring and protests in Brazil
too,
last year.
Indeed, yes.
It seemed to have come from nothing. People usually start with one little cause.
Yes.
It can be easily identified, and all of a sudden it's so broad, they're against everything.
Yes, so, there's no doubt we're sitting on a situation which could easily ignite. Whether it will or not is anyone's guess. But there's no doubt that people are more and more attentive and angry about the scale of income differences and what happens to most people's incomes and what happens to the top few percent.
Good.
Okay.
Thanks very much.
You.